Hopefully everyone got that. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I, and Princeton University, as the organizers of today's panel, reside on unceded ancestral land of the Lenape people. And I had a few different ideas about how I wanted to do today's land acknowledgement, but I think really what I would like to say is that land acknowledgements are and always should be regarded as a first step towards land return. And I think I'll leave it at that. So today we're going to be, as I said, coming together to discuss Allison K. Spurgis's book, Diagnosing Desire, that was published by the Ohio State University Press in 2020. Spurgis's exploration of the new science of female sexuality reveals the material discursive regimes that produce and regulate femininity, particularly as white and cis heteronormative in the 21st century. Diagnosing Desire specifically interrogates the white feminization of receptive or responsive desire in contemporary sexual medicine, experimental sexology, and alternative wellness modalities aimed at sexual self-optimization or self-care. Through an examination of the ways in which sex researchers and sex therapists study and manage women with low desire, Spurgis contends that a feminized responsive desire framework for understanding women's sexuality emerges out of this sexological field, producing female sexuality as a complex problem to be solved. A thorough and novel sociological investigation and a mixed methodological analysis, Diagnosing Desire has significant import for those critical investigators and practitioners of the science of sex. So I'd like to move ahead to talk about our participants for today. So first and foremost, we have our author, respondent, Allison K. Spurgis, they, she, from Trinity College. Allison is an assistant professor of sociology who researches, writes, and teaches about the sociology of trauma and the politics of desire from an interdisciplinary and intersectional feminist perspective. In terms of our panelists, we are lucky enough to have three with us today. The first is Jane Ward, she, her, from the University of California, Riverside. Jane is the professor and chair of gender and sexuality studies and teaches courses in feminist, queer, and heterosexuality studies. She is the author of The Tragedy of Heterosexuality, published by New York University Press in 2020, and Not Gay, Sex Between Straight White Men, published by New York University Press in 2015. Additionally, we have Tom Waidzunas here, he, him, who is joining us from Temple University. Tom is an associate professor of sociology, and his research involves questions at the intersection of sexuality studies, science studies, and the sociology of social movements. He is the author of The Straight Line, How the Fringe Science of Ex-Gay Therapy Reoriented Sexuality, published by University of Minnesota Press in 2015. And our last panelist, Patrick Brazanka, he, him, joins us from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Patrick is the associate professor of psychology and chair of the interdisciplinary program in women, gender, and sexuality studies. Brazanka is an interdisciplinary social scientist who works at the nexus of sociology, critical psychology, and science and technology studies. He is the editor of Intersectionality, Foundations, and Frontiers, published by Routledge in 2019. And our moderator for today is Angela Jones, they, she, joining us from SUNY Farmingdale. Professor of sociology, Jones's research interests include African-American political thought and protest, race, gender, sexuality, sex work, feminist theory, and queer methodologies and theory. Their most recent book is Camming, Money, Power, and Pleasure in the Sex Work Industry, published by New York University Press in 2020. So I am thrilled to welcome everyone here today, and I'd like us to jump right in. So first off, we're going to have Angela Jones, who's going to be providing us some wonderful introductory comments with regard to the book, and then we'll be moving on with our panelists.
Thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you all for being here. It is such a pleasure to be here and in conversation with such amazing thinkers and to be discussing such a truly extraordinary book. So I have the daunting task of providing a summary of the book, and I say daunting only because there is so much brilliance and theoretical nuance that I will undoubtedly not do the book justice, but here goes in broad strokes. So Diagnosing Desire draws from interviews with women who self-identify as lacking sexual desire or who have low sexual desire. The sample includes women who have sought out medical and therapeutic treatments or who have considered reaching out for support for their lack of sexual desire. Using this interview data alongside critical discourse analysis of medical and scientific articles and analytical observations at clinics and workshops, analyzes the tensions between expert discourses on so-called low female desire and the actual experiences of women with a lack of sexual desire. Introducing the book's main stake, Spurgeon opposes many critical questions. So for example, how and when did the idea that women as a group are sexually receptive emerge? How did such discourses become popularized? How does the logic of feminine receptivity and responsiveness affect femmes? Also, how did these sex differences become accepted knowledge? And how did experts and scientists perpetuate these ideas? What contemporary technologies reproduce ideas regarding binary sex differences? And as for me as a reader, most critically, why do so many women come to understand, think about, and experience their sexual desires as lacking, low, or as a problem? How do they experience their sexualities and genders? How do they characterize their current and past sexual encounters? How and can their partners help increase their desires? Spurgeon tackles all these questions and so many more. In the front end of the book, they examine the discursive development of what they aptly call the feminized response desire framework, and in turn, the biopolitics generated in sexology and scientists and clinicians pathologizing of low sexual desire and women more broadly. This new science of female sexuality is buttressed by the idea of inherent or biological sexual difference. The idea that men and women have vastly different sexual problems and that low sexual desire is a woman's problem. Sex researchers created new tropes to understand women's sexuality, but such frames describe and categorize women's sexuality as inherently receptive and responsive to male desire. Thus, Spurgeon explores how discourses regarding receptivity and responsiveness became gendered and how this new science of female sexuality influences people's lived experiences of desire. For me, one of the greatest strengths of this book is that they give us a master class in applying intersectionality with precision and deep feminist care. And Allison, we thank you for that. Writing from a crip, queer, feminist perspective, they show how these discourses pathologize queer femmes, trans and non-binary people, and explore the white supremacist, ableist, heteropatriarchal, and cis-sexist foundations of the feminized response desire framework. It's in the later chapters of the book, which were my favorite ones, that they turn directly to the interviews with the women in the study. And for me, this data really animates and brings to life some of the book's most worthwhile interventions, namely how women undergo sexual difference socialization, or as they define it, quote, the experience of one's sexuality and femininity through pervasive, scientific, therapeutic, and popular discourses that prescribe gender differences in sexual desire and behavior, and how the category women with low desire is not only produced discursively via sexual medicine, but also how members of this population are socialized into being through gendered sexual expectations that are part and parcel of the contemporary sexology and its associated scripts. Now, once socialized in this way, experts encourage women to do sexual care work as part of ongoing self-care. Now, this might include mindfulness workshops and various therapeutic and medical treatments to attend to their problems of low sexual desire. Thus, this feminized sexual care work becomes a biopolitical mandate. However, not all women buy into the feminized sexual care industry. For kink practitioners, for example, especially those who are subs, the reclaiming of receptivity and submission is empowering. And further, Spurgis uses this analysis to also make space for ace and arrow folks for whom these frames completely erase and ignore. Now, before I pass the Zoom mic to the amazing Jane Ward for comments, I want to say just a bit about the book's conclusion. And here, Spurgeon makes an amazing intellectual move that I truly appreciated. And so as opposed to just a kind of re-articulation of the book's main arguments and evidence only, they draw from critical feminist disability studies and crip theory to ask readers to consider what a different model of care and radical community might look like. And so I actually want to end my comments with a taste, for those of you who haven't read this, for a little taste of Allison's powerful words, for which I'll turn to the last page. We need a better feminism that isn't just about offering solutions to women with low desire in the vein of, quote, women should get treatments for sexual dysfunctions too. We need a feminist science, medicine, and therapy that doesn't individualize or essentialize sexual problems and instead looks to the socio-political and structural ways that common experiences of violence create traumatized populations and understand that, of course, these experiences affect and produce the desire of the members of these populations. We must think about the diversity of women and femmes and their experiences and remember that solutions aren't solutions for everyone, and in fact, may be harmful to some. It is with an eye toward this that we might stand in solidarity as members of these populations rather than seeking to heal ourselves from trauma, low desire, and sexual dysfunction as individuals or to attempt self-rehabilitation. Caring for each other in community while also attending to difference is a radical alternative to the isolation of self-care and a radical alternative to simply trying to survive or get by. Rather than always trying to recover, to cure ourselves and navigating these coercive structures on our own, maybe there is freedom in falling apart together. Well, amen. And now I'm going to turn this over to our amazing panelists who are going to provide their comments, and then we will all turn to everyone here in the audience for your questions and comments. Jane?
Thank you, Angela. That was truly excellent. And of course, thank you, Allison, for writing this incredible book. Thank you for inviting me to be in conversation with all of you about it. The book is somehow enraging and also really funny in its absurdity at the same time. That was my experience. I was laughing a lot at the medical industrial complex as I was reading this book and how, you know, just how many somersaults it's doing to try to understand women and how in many ways women and femmes remain sort of illegible to the medical industry and how there's a kind of deliciousness in that. So as Angela explained, this book opens with a survey of the behavioral and evolutionary psych approaches that have really dominated modern thinking about sexual desire. And these will be familiar to everybody on this Zoom. This is the whole host of familiar narratives about how women's desire is more complex than men's due to women's ostensibly natural maternal instinct and the reproductive consequences of the sex that they must manage, all of this evolutionary garbage. And then also a narrative about how men are hardwired to be spontaneously aroused and sexually aggressive, while women are hardwired to be receptive, but not autonomously aroused. So men's sexual desire is embodied, it's spontaneous, it's unstoppable. I sometimes describe this as hydraulic, while women's needs to be activated or triggered by somebody else. So in other words, men have desire and women are objects of desire. My favorite, and I think the most telling and theoretically generative part of this book, is the way that it explores how gendered ideas about sexual desire rely on and then reinforce the notion of a mind-body split, where the body is understood to be an objective and reliable source of hard data, while the woman herself, I mean, minus her clit and vagina, is a source of contradictory and questionable information. So the book does a dazzling job of tracing how sexologists focus on measuring and explaining the so-called gap between what women say we desire and what our genitals respond to in laboratories. And so we learn in the book that this kind of measurement of the genitals, whether they become enlarged or lubricated and so on, is called plethysmography. Am I pronouncing that correctly, Allison? Okay. And that sexologists believe that it really offers them what they have been fantasizing about, which is a way to get to the ultimate truth of sexual desire. And of course, what they find is a story wholly consistent with heteropatriarchal accounts of sex, which is that men's sexuality is very simple and concordant. What they say they desire is what their genitals respond to, while women are a discordant mystery. Women's genitals betray us, it turns out, by responding or not responding in unpredictable ways. Again, it's like this is one of the ways that our not just women's subjectivity, but also our genitals are sort of illegible. So the book does a stellar job of documenting the ways that beliefs in women's sexual receptivity have undergone a kind of feminist rebranding in the 21st century by sexologists like Lisa Diamond, who I have argued with, and many of these feminist sexologists are basically argue that with the right trigger, women can be down for anything, from watching we might get aroused by watching bonobos have sex or any kind of visual stimulation, and that this is one of our special features, that it should be a point of pride for women. So feminist sexologists also use this data on women's discordant genital response to try to normalize women's ostensibly low sexual desire. And they frame it as a natural outcome of women's sexual hardwiring that, as Angela said, can nonetheless be improved through mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy. So they argue that women have a totally different relationship to sex than men, and that it's sexism that holds women to the same expectation of spontaneous arousal that men experience. And so through this lens, allowing women to be low desiring is a kind of feminist gift. It's a feminist move. So Allison grapples with all of this with such clarity, and the sharpness of their critique is incredibly rewarding as a reader. They illuminate the ways that even these pop feminist reframings are reproducing women as an essential population that's imagined as white, middle class, straight, cisgender. The assumption that receptivity is a bioevolutionary adaptation for women rather than the outcome of girls' and women's gender socialization, of course, also means that trauma goes unaccounted for, as does all of the sexual labor that's required to be legible as a girl or a woman. One of the most hard-hitting interventions this book makes is that it shows us that women are expected to have low desire, and that this gets affirmed discursively by women themselves, unless women are invited to think critically, queerly, and feministly about what sex is. And this is where we get to what's probably my favorite line in the book, from page 186. So here's Allison. In general, participants seem to have lots of desire, contrary even to their own self-characterizations as low desiring. Through our discussions, in fact, many women identified the self-diagnosing trend and revised their initial self-diagnosis, stating instead that they do, in fact, experience sexual desire, just not the type of sex they are expected to have, and in some cases, not for the type of sex their partners want to have with them. This phenomenon evidences how the hermeneutics of low sexual desire are really the only frames of reference that women have available to interpret their experiences if they don't like the sex they're having. The feminized responsive desire framework dictates how women interpret their own sexual complaints, including when these complaints are actually about gender relations or gender itself. That was totally a mic drop moment, I thought, in the book. The book also offers us a really brilliant queering of the so-called low desire and receptivity frame by leaving behind the really well-worn and myopic notion that these are innate elements attached to biological femaleness, and then instead considering low desire as a very gender inclusive option that's of course not unique to people who identify as women, and also as a kind of experience that might go by other names like submission or dominance or a number of kinks that masquerade as low desire when people have no outlets to express them. If the kind of sex that you want to have isn't available to you or your partners won't participate in it, then you may very well experience yourself as having low desire. So the book leads us toward the very useful concept of parasexual pleasure to describe the pleasures that sit outside of what normatively counts as sex. So those were the highlights for me. I'm going to end with a few kind of weird questions from me about this book. They don't need to be answered, Allison, and if they don't speak to you, I'm just like putting them out into the universe. So my first question is about plethysmography and whether it might make sense to understand it on a spectrum of genital focused cultural practices like gender reveal rituals and virginity tests and all of the ways that cis people ruminate on trans people's genitals. All of these epistemological flashpoints where genitals are claimed as a source of objective truth that might otherwise be obscured by people's self-reports. I don't know exactly what to call this. Is it genital philia? Is it genital supremacy? Is it genital phobia? Is it a genital-based epistemology? It's a kind of obsessive measuring, protecting, exposing, revealing paradigm in which the genitals, again, become the most reliable source of information. So I'm really curious, Allison, if you also see this relationship between plethysmography and other kinds of gender reveal practices. My second question is about the DSM, and I think about it a lot because my mom is a therapist, so I grew up playing with it as a kid. We would flip to a random page and then you had to name someone in the family who had that disorder, or you'd have to name someone in the family and then find their disorder. So the DSM is very familiar and familial to me. I enjoy making up my own entries for cis straight men in particular, like deficient sexual imagination disorder or sexual entitlement disorder or sexual receptivity aversion disorder, which a lot of men have, especially around the anus. Because the language of medical pathology is very powerful. And so I wonder if you think it makes sense to use this language creatively to expose some of the dysfunctions of white heteromasculinity, or whether you think we should scrap it altogether. And then lastly, the book very provocatively points toward the question, what is the sexual? Could we and should we define it more expansively, and might we expect the diagnosis of low sexual desire to disappear as a consequence of that expansive reframing? So I'll end there. Thank you for this wonderful, wonderful book.
And I'll invite Tom to go next.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. And thanks, Jane. It's an honor to follow Jane Ward here on the panel. Hello, my name is Tom Waitzunas. This semester, I exercised my always developing skills to tune out the cacophony of antipathy toward critical race theory, gender studies, and any other number of conveniently misunderstood scapegoats of our current historical moment in order to focus on reading this richly theorized and well-researched book, Diagnosing Desire, Biopolitics and Femininity into the 21st Century by Allison K. Spurgess. And I'm so glad I did, for it is a tremendously rewarding read and one that certainly inspires many questions. I've been quite a fan of this book, and I've been really interested in promoting it, especially as I feel like it speaks to lacks in my own work. You know, my own work traces a history of scientific constructs and measurements of sexual orientation within conflicts over conversion therapy that emphasizes the sexuality of male-assigned people with penises that sexologists typically reduce to men in the binary world of psychology and sexology. And like much work in science studies, in some ways, my work reifies the dominance of scientific discourses by focusing on them as dominant. And in that world, discussions of sexuality and sexual orientation often meld seamlessly into discussions of male sexual orientation without acknowledging that slippage. So when I encountered Diagnosing Desire, I immediately thought, this is a very important book, you know, really highlighting female desire, and female sexuality. For many years in my undergraduate human sexuality course, we've talked about and debated the merits of physiological testing for sexuality, including explaining the difference between penile plethysmography and vaginal photoplethysmography. And I've had a slide for years showing Daniel Bergner's story, What Women Want, from the New York Times that Allison begins the book with, explaining the research of psychologist Meredith Shivers, who uses photoplethysmography in a range of different forms of pornography, including images of bonobo chimps, to argue that women experience a discordance between their subjective arousal and their physiological arousal. With students, we've had discussions about whether and why this might be the case, and attempted to explain it using theories of gender socialization. But here in this book, Allison has answered really helped to answer this question that we think about in an incredibly important contribution to the literature on sexology. Coming from sociology, where there's all these emphasis on ends and such, in sample sizes, I find the strength of this book to be the strategic juxtaposition of the different kinds of data. The juxtaposition of contemporary science of feminine sexual science, the critique of medicalization practices and therapeutics that extend beyond just the critique of psychopharmacology to look also at the critique of mindfulness and such, the voices of women who might be diagnosed with low desire, and analyses of sexual work and forms of resistance to the tropes in sexology. Juxtaposing these things strategically makes it particularly effective. It makes the book particularly effective in its arguments. So the book makes a major contribution to the literature on sexology and science studies and sociology, insofar as it identifies the trajectory of theories and practices in that field with the evolution of thinking about gender difference, while deploying an intersectional feminist critique of sexology, sex therapy, and experimental and clinical psychology. And shows the problematic assumptions built into mindfulness and complementary and alternative medicine along with psychopharmacology, which I found to be extremely valuable, ultimately arguing for this more radical and communal form of care, including in acknowledgement of some liberatory potential of BDSM practices. One thing I really like about the book is a stylistic point in the way that the reader-friendly way that Allison continually circles back around to key questions and makes useful connections to the original problem of the new sexual science of femininity, bringing out the full effect of the juxtapositions that she makes throughout the book and then offers critiques. So for example, in discussing Helen Kaplan's sex therapy views, Allison tells us that it's imperative that sex therapists consider a range of etiologies of sexual troubles and the ways that troubles can arise from both personal experience and relational history and from structural and cultural influences, in addition to unique ways she says, in which sexual concerns may be manifested by women and gender diverse individuals, and particularly folks of color in these groups, in light of the disproportionate experiences of trauma when designing treatments. And then calls for sociological, critical, and intersectional feminist analyses of sexuality and gender to be integrated into clinical and therapeutic treatment programs. We're always made aware of the stakes in these various medico-scientific practices in the absence of structural inequalities and power relations obfuscated by individualizing and essentializing sexology paradigms. I think my favorite critique in the book is when Allison considers mindfulness practice as potentially sadomasochistic, whereby she says, quote, mindfulness-based sex therapy appears to suggest the utility of an internalized system of self-domination and self-submission. The body dominates the mind, or should, but the mind has to train itself to get in line with this, which is the sub and which is the dom. This critique makes me think about how many organizations now recommend mindfulness for stress management in lieu of various structural organizational changes for workers, and how such practices are not simply about getting in touch with our bodies, but get us out of touch with structural arrangements and problems. Perhaps that is why they're so popular. Each chapter is richly theorized, adeptly moving us through intersectional analyses of medicalization, gender socialization, sexual labor, crypistemology is a new term for me, crypistemology, biopolitics, governmentality, and sex-positive feminism. I learned a tremendous amount from reading through the crypistemology that foregrounded other sequences of desire and arousal relative to what was prescribed by sexual medicine. And thinking with this framework is tremendously useful and productive to get us to consider low desire not as pathology, but instead to consider how certain enactments of low desire among the feminized and their physiological manifestations are, quote, potentially political, subversive, and even insurrectionary. That I found to be like really, really powerful utilization of that crypistemology, if I'm saying the word right. One aspect of the book that I also really appreciate is the deployment of an approach steeped in feminist science studies that appreciates body minds or challenges the duality between body and mind. In so doing, Allison laments what has been lost by jettisoning psychoanalysis from sexology altogether, even as the new female sexual science seems to align with it in some ways. But while resisting the kinds of generalizations about development that psychoanalysis offers, Allison still wants to consider the ways that trauma may affect desire / arousal / interest, etc., and to consider the linkages that exist between body and mind, including the ways that scientific discourses themselves shape phenomenological experience. Yet Allison also seems to call for plurality. And I was really struck by a quote from Louise on page 90, who is a psychologist and activist critical of Bassan's model of the circular sexual response cycle, who thinks that this circular model is prescriptive and narrow, but then concludes, quote, I'm not crazy about her model, and I'm not crazy about any model because I don't think there is a model. And as I get through the conclusion of the book, I'm still kind of left wondering to what extent this position, that there should be no model, is perhaps the most valuable, given that the plurality of experiences that women have on the one hand exist, yet the book still seems to gesture toward there at least being some solutions for some women, even if these solutions are not the same for all and may be harmful to some. So I wonder, is Allison, are you agreeing with Louise here, or calling for a kind of proliferation of models where we might understand that in one model, it is common for many women to experience desire within the context of trust, or in another model, it's common to experience a sense of control within a BDSM scene, but that doesn't work for everyone. The book also points out how psychology has come a long way from measuring something as coarse as attraction in constructing women's sexuality. Allison walks us through a series of constructs that seem to continue to multiply: desire, physiological desire, arousal, sexual desire, subjective arousal, wanting, attraction, like all of these terms. And we learn that these concepts are incommensurate between men and women, where especially desire means something different for men and for women. And I think one of the challenges in writing a book like this is to figure out what language to use as an author when describing entities that might be contested among various actors. I faced this when trying to write about conversion therapy, because some people call that torture, or they call it sexual reorientation therapy, all kinds of different things. So what terms do we use? And in this section on desire, interest, arousal, linkages and lacuna in embodied psychic sexual states, we learn that ways that women feel about the concepts within the diagnosis FSIAD that prescribes that sex is better when arousal precedes desire. We learn about their feelings about this. And we learn that some women experience untriggered sexual desire, not just for their current partner, nor in the context of routinized sex lives, where desire becomes this kind of special realm for them with active fantasy lives. It's their own version of desire. And the point is that sexual desire is not absent within these supposedly low desiring women, but it's often sequestered into another domain. But that made me wonder, like, what do you mean by desire when you use the term? You know, there's a masculinized version of it, there's a feminized version of it. And I wondered, you know, do we need a new language, given what, you know, the baggage that terms like this have? And I wondered, what, you know, do you mean something in between the masculinized version and the feminized version of desire? Some things this book really raised for me, as have written a lot about male sexuality, is considering the role of gender socialization in the formation of these kinds of expectations about sexual practice and feminized receptivity that men have, including some gay men who expect receptivity from their partners. And it has me thinking about how under-theorized male receptivity is within sexological literature and why that is. What would it mean for there to be a male version of the pathologization of low desire and receptivity, regardless of sexual orientation? It certainly that question places the power dynamics implicit within this diagnosis into relief. Even erectile dysfunction is understood as a pathology of the active role. But the book also makes me wonder about the role of trauma and gender socialization in the formation of various versions of male sexuality as well, given that Barry Thorne and Zella Luria, in their famous study of children on playgrounds, found that boys who expressed vulnerability were mercilessly teased in ways that ultimately set them up for sexual scripts later in life that placed a priority of sex over intimacy. And violence is a common theme in boys' lives, especially inflicted upon those who deviate from masculine norms. So the Foucauldian analysis of sexual socialization and internalization of notions of sexuality may be applicable to men in some ways as well. But a final point involving the BDSM as a tool for many women. I found this chapter so fascinating, the ways that many of these women were using BDSM as a tool to work through trauma. And one way I wanted to push you a bit in this chapter is the book is wonderful in dealing with intersectional analyses, especially in criticizing white feminisms and one-size-fits-all prescriptions based on white bourgeois women's experience. But I would want to push you further to carry that analysis into the realm of sex positivity, where various social hierarchies of race, gender, ability are pronounced within sexual subcultures, especially on this chapter on reclaiming receptivity. A few years ago, Ariane Cruz published a book, The Color of Kink, Black Women, BDSM, and Pornography, analyzing the ways Black women work through many complex contradictions in BDSM practice, throwing into relief the racialized histories of language of master, slave, bondage, and other terms, considering the difficult complexities of race play that many of these folks in the book work through. We worked through this when we read the book in my graduate sexuality seminar, and it was really challenging work. So I would just wonder, to what extent could you consider the complexities of intersectionality regarding BDSM in your sample? And what does reclaiming receptivity entail relative to one's race, ability, status, class, or other statuses beyond gender?
Thank you so much, Tom. Pat, you're up.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Angela. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you, Catherine, for organizing. Allison, thank you for inviting me to speak about your remarkable book. It's an incredible honor to go after my friends and colleagues, Angela, Jane, and Tom, but I'll also admit to a little bit of intimidation. I am speaking to you at, as Catherine described, the nexus of sociology, critical psychology, and feminist STS. But I read this book right now, institutionally located in the context of a psychology department. And it was exciting, enticing, and challenging to think about the knowledges that are produced by evolutionary social psychologists working 2 doors down from me in the context of your work. And so I'm going to be relatively brief, but it's from that standpoint epistemically that I encountered this really amazing project. I want to suggest that from my read, it doesn't have to be everyone's read, but from my read, that there's a kind of overarching theme, or perhaps a warning, or an implicit thesis, or a theoretical thread that extends beyond these data, or beyond the scene of so-called female sexual dysfunction. And that is that complexity, particularly scientific complexity, does not equal or even portend liberation. What I mean by that is that in Allison's work, we find that the project of female sexual dysfunction is not easily characterized as primarily reductionist, even if so many of its implications are reductionist. Instead, what Allison exposes is an incredibly complex scientific network of exceedingly complicated technologies, theoretical explanations, and multiple paradigms, interdisciplinary work that all produce this hyper-complex site of oppression. And I think that that's one of the most exciting, sobering parts of the book, is that the story of, again, so-called female sexual dysfunction is not easy or simple, and yet exposes how the promise of advanced technoscience so often winds up leading us to very familiar stories of white supremacy, cis heteropatriarchy, and ableism. So from my read, I'd like to suggest 3 particular insights that Allison offers us in the book. The first is one about STS. So I think that the book really pushes us beyond more traditional, if also critical, STS approaches that foreground questions of category construction, categorization. So I was really pleasantly surprised that the book is not just about the history and sociology of categorizing female sexual dysfunction. Now, certainly, Allison does the work of explaining how competing paradigms emerged and how particular ideas about physiological responses and subjective experience came to dominate contemporary scientific accounts of this group, this population, women with low desire, including, the constitution of this category. But I think far more importantly, the book is really about the processes by and through which actual people experience low desire as a scientific project, a scientific enterprise, and as a felt experience. And I don't think that this point should be understated. The book takes very seriously embodied knowledge and embodiment in ways that offer important lessons for STS work that typically privileges, for example, the scientific and legal record above and beyond experiences of science's objects and subjects, which I think is really interesting because that's what Jane pointed us to earlier about sexology and a key lesson of the book. That is to say, the processes of treating certain kinds of purportedly objective data as superior and more trustworthy than phenomenology and subjectivities. So I think that if we want to be a little meta here and think about the disciplinary implications of Allison's work in feminist STS, it's that she actually is implicitly critiquing some of the ways that more traditional strands of STS treat certain kinds of knowledge and data in the scientific record as more serious and as more important than other kinds of data related to science and knowledge construction. Allison accomplishes this not only through interviews, and I think that that's really important. And my co-panelists have already spoken to this a little bit, so I won't belabor the point. But we all know that qualitative research can be just as objectifying as quantitative research. And so I don't want to just suggest here that by simply speaking to women and femmes that Allison has done something liberatory. It's actually much more important, I think, that throughout the entire project, a focus on embodiment through her method, including the study of scientific texts and scientific discourse, carefully probing the assumptions made by not only allegedly apolitical basic scientists, but by feminists. And that brings me to my next point. So the second thing I want to argue is that the book is truly an indispensable critique of feminist psychology and of the emergence of the psychology of women. And this is one of the moments that made me, Allison, a cis white man who teaches regularly the psychology of gender and represents so much of the paradigmatic work that you critique, that really was so exciting and troubling to me. I want to say that I have more questions than answers at this point, and I suspect I'm going to be making sense of this component of the book manuscript for many years to come. It's really, really cataclysmic, I think, in its implications, but I want to provide a little bit of context for why I say so. From within a deeply masculinist and white supremacist discipline, that is psychology, contemporary American psychology, protecting the psychology of women as an area and discourse within the discipline is a kind of tacit feminist assumption. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a robust and vocal recognition of the ways that the paradigm of the psychology of women has been exclusionary in terms of identity and difference. That is, it's been transphobic, it's been racist, et cetera, ableist, among other things, of course. But I think far less obvious or salient is the critique that Allison offers, how the emergence of the psychology of women advanced scientific misogyny, including quite plainly the sexual subjugation of even prototypical white women. Allison does a truly remarkable job exploring how the zeitgeist of cultural feminism created an epistemic space in psychological discourse for the production of women with low desire, not despite, but because of the single axis feminist agenda that anchors cultural feminism. Now, sure, lots of people have highlighted the empirical and theoretical flaws of, for example, Carol Gilligan's work, which comes up here. But Allison goes much farther in this book, much, much farther. And I want to read a quote from page 77. For those of you who have it out, you can read along. This is towards the bottom of the page. This review of the existing psychological theory on female discordance seems to be a positive harbinger of potential change in mainstream sexology. And it makes me hopeful that some researchers are considering explanations for phenomena outside of evolutionary psychology narratives. But in light of the history of how volumetric tools have been implemented to tell the truth of desire, I worry about how they are still being used to construct a new model for women's sexuality, one that will invariably produce feminized populations, even if those populations are now more internally diverse. So she leaves us with disquieting questions. And I've just generated a few of them here. There are many more that we will need to wrestle with, I believe. What role does feminist empiricism, or what role does feminist empiricism can or should play in sexual and anti-racist liberation projects? What kinds of reparations does feminist psychology owe in the wake of the discourse of female sexual dysfunction, which it colluded to produce? I think that feminist psychologists, and I'm actually going to, for a moment, identify as one. I think that we are quite comfortable talking about mainstream psychology's abuses, but it is much more difficult to consider the role that feminist and even intersectional psychology has played in the production of, for lack of a better word, oppression. How can we use Allison's insights here to critique other discourses of empowerment? Including, and I'm speaking about specifically scientific discourse of empowerment, including other projects that are viewed contemporarily, that is today, much more favorably, such as the feminist discourse on trauma and healing, which Allison is kind of circling around and within in parts of the book, or the language of the pandemic of racism that has become so wildly popular among psychologists today. Again, I have much more to think about, which I think is the hallmark of a challenging and important book. So the third and final point that I'd like to make before I stop is that the book title, and indeed Allison's focus on disorder, is ultimately a powerful heuristic, and I would suggest deeply ironic. And I want to say that I'm really indebted to many of the people on this panel, as well as this entire Zoom room, for the capacity to be able to find or make sense of what I'm about to say. The analysis of the scientific record, much less Allison's interviews that yield powerful stories of trauma, pain, and quotidian violence, they reveal female sexual dysfunction and invisible care work around men's, and really cis and straight men's, sexual self-esteem, pleasure, and self-worth to be endemic to heterosexuality and not at all abnormal. So the kind of argument to me is that the production of biomedicalized female sexual dysfunction is actually central to the project of maintaining cis heteropatriarchy. And it establishes heteronormative sexual scripts as non-pathological and unextraordinary. So ultimately, there becomes nothing unusual about tremendous pain during sex, about marital rape, or as Allison puts it, assault-adjacent sexualities. Nor does the science and treatment of female sexual dysfunction position these dynamics as unusual at all. Instead, an apparatus and infrastructure of white middle-class American women's sexual dysfunction elaborates itself as the normal and natural state of being that is to be managed by women and not entirely through advanced techno-scientific means. And this is something that Tom concluded with. And that's where I want to kind of end. Rather than deductively impose biomedicalization hypothesis on these data, Allison allows this archive of disordered feelings to point us toward the ways female sexual desires are managed partially through non-biomedical means, including mindfulness and intrapsychic negotiations beyond the direct reach of technoscience. But still function as manifestations of biopower in all its dazzling capacities to compel particular behaviors and to cohere certain subjectivities. It's exciting to me how, not unlike Tom's work, there's a place here for biomedicalization, but it doesn't become so hegemonic as to obscure the non-technoscientific ways that female sexual dysfunction is both produced, experienced, managed, and resisted. So with that, I am going to stop. And I want to thank you again, Allison, for your wonderful work. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Jane. Thank you again to all of you in the audience. Just a note, before we turn it over to Allison, who is going to respond to all these amazing comments, just a note to folks in the audience, please start getting your questions ready. Once Allison is done responding, Catherine and I are going to do our best to field all of your questions, which you can either use the hand function or you can use the chat, but do start getting those questions ready. Allison?
Thank you so much to all of you. I just want to say quickly, thanks to Princeton, again, thanks to all of these amazing panelists who are such wonderful scholars and activists for participating in a discussion about my book. It really, really means a lot to me. I also want to just really quickly say that there's been a little information in the chat about some access stuff that I think is important. I understand that this hasn't been transcribed in real time just due to technical capacity. So I just wanted to say, if anybody does want a transcript, just to make sure you do reach out to the folks at Princeton at gss@princeton.edu. So just to be clear about that. I think that I wanna start. I mean, you all have given me so many amazing questions to ruminate about. I really appreciate the ways that you have drawn attention to really specific parts of my book. I feel so seen. It really means a lot. It really means a lot. But I wanted to say a little bit about what I think is so amazing about this particular panel. And all of your work. And so I would start by saying that I think that all of us, and I hope that I can consider myself part of a group with you amazing, brilliant folks. I think that we're all kind of bad disciplinary subjects. We're very kind of interdisciplinary. And I think that I take a lot of I'm so excited about all of your work and your projects historically, because you are bad disciplinary subjects. And that's, I think, so awesome. And I think we've all felt some kind of pain and discomfort around that at various points. But I think that it's also hopefully a point of kind of pride and solidarity amongst us as well. I think that all of you, and I hope I can include myself here a little bit, really point to the possibilities of critique and to critical possibilities, and try to do critique in a loving and generative way. And all of you, I think, do that in such wonderful, amazing ways, and I appreciate it so very much. And I also think that all of you push methodological boundaries in really important ways within the fields that we work in. So thank you so much for doing that, and I hope that I do that too, and it seems like hopefully I do. It sounds like at least what Patrick said kind of gestures toward that. So, just really briefly, I just want to acknowledge how much I've learned from Catherine about the work on securing cisgendered futures, which is incredibly important to my own work. I think that the focus on this idea of securing cisgenderness is actually like a really important, huge theme in my book. And I feel like all of you have touched on that. So I really appreciate that. Angela, thank you so much for focusing and bringing light to a sociology and a politics of pleasure. I think that kind of, as much as I focus on trauma in my book, I think that the flip side of that is obviously pleasure. So thank you so much for bringing that into disciplinary conversations. And I think one thing I was rereading Camming, and I've been rereading all of your work in these past couple of weeks, and I was just thinking, particularly with Angela's work, about how it's kind of amazing that the stories that Angela tells in Camming are about, in many cases, much more pleasure than the stories that I tell, right? So that the sex workers that Angela interviews are able to experience and harness pleasure in a much different way than a lot of my participants that are having sex for free. So I just think that that's important to note. Jane, I really appreciate you being part of this conversation. Your work on the heterosexual repair industry, I think, is just, I mean, when I read The Tragedy of Heterosexuality, I was like, this is my kindred book. Your book came out just a couple months before mine did, and I was like, we are really in conversation here. And I think that a lot of what I've said about mindfulness and about these kind of like non-psycho pharmaceutical treatments and kind of modes of self-care are absolutely also part of this heterosexual repair industry. Tom, I just want to thank you for the thoroughness of your book, The Straight Line. I learned so much from your work. I think that the biggest takeaway from your work that is so important to me is that you really point out that that no particular orientation to biology or innateness or inbornness is inherently better politically. right? That these kinds of ideas are actually fought in social movements. And Patrick, you've also written about that, so thank you so much. And then finally, Patrick, I was reading your argument for bad psychology last night before this panel, and just realizing that I hope that I'm not a psychologist, but I hope that if I were, or if I were going to be one, I think I would be a bad one. So thank you so much for your work that just really emphasizes that intersectionality cannot be an additive model. It can't be a factor that just gets added to a model of thinking about sexuality. It has to be the basis, right? Thinking structurally, thinking about race has to be the basis by which we think through every other category of life. And then also just what you pointed out today, just that scientific kind of multiplicity does not equal justice. It's about how we employ it, how we deploy it, right? So I just really appreciate you kind of bringing that up again, and also just the idea that advanced technoscience is not always advanced, or we have to think about what we even mean by advanced. So just wanted to say that to start, that I so appreciate all of your work, and it means so much that you engage with my book with the thoughtfulness and care that you did here today. So just briefly, I want to speak to a couple of the questions that came up. Jane raised some really amazing questions about, I love the idea of plethysmography as a gender reveal practice, kind of being part of that kind of broader world in which people in our society are so fixated on gender reveal, right? On like kind of what the truth and that kind of genital focus too, right? Because that is a huge important piece of my book, is just to say that this kind of relationship between mind and body is gendered, like through this discourse, right? It's like that is what so many of the sexologists and scientists that I'm looking at are creating, right? Is kind of a cisgender femininity, literally through the practice of measuring subjective experiences versus genitals. And so discordance becomes feminized, and it is a gender reveal practice, right? And concordance becomes masculinized. And it's totally cis heteronormative, right? Just like through and through. There's no space for anything beyond that. And actually, to connect something that Tom said then to that also, I think that thinking about that kind of that mind body, disconnect, the work of the gap, the work of that of that disconnect. And sorry, I kind of lost what I was going to say there, but I think that both Jane and Tom, that you kind of zeroed in on the ultimate critique that I have, which is that there is this obsession with comparing genitals to subjectivities, right? And the idea that one is kind of more truthful, and that is, that's a way that's what we should be focusing on. A couple of really quick things just to speak to other things that Jane brought up. I love the idea of queering disorder, of kind of looking at of the DSM or even disorder language and kind of like queering it. I think this is complicated, and I want to be careful and thoughtful about this, because so many disorders, right, have these really complicated histories of being attached to sickness and to disease and wanting to kind of get rid of those, and then also needing those certain, disorders, those like kind of nomenclatures in order to get certain kinds of treatment. So it's a really complicated history there, but I love the idea of also being playful and kind of queering the language of disorder. A couple of other points, I'm just gonna kind of like look at all of these amazing notes that I took. I really appreciate, Tom, I really appreciate you pointing to the question of models, and whether or not there should be any models for sexuality and for desire, and also the question of desire. I don't think that desire in and of itself is a bad thing. I think that desire can be really exciting. I think desiring something or someone can be an exciting and fun thing. I do think that we don't talk enough about pleasure, and I think that scientists and sexologists don't either. And I think that there's been somewhat of a shift toward trying to do that, but I don't think it's been adequate. So yeah, I mean, just thinking through that kind of like age-old debate about desire and pleasure, but I think that the desire itself can be pleasurable. And so I'm not, I don't know, I don't have like a normative orientation toward whether or not like low desire is a bad thing. I mean, having low desire could be an exciting thing, right? Having low desire could be a thing that's like, you're gesturing toward wanting something more. And it could be a really an obvious kind of response to a situation in one's life that where you're wanting more, you're wanting to create something more exciting for yourself. So desire is not the problem. I do think that models are problematic. I don't know what to do about that. I definitely think that gendered models are not working, right? Because of all the reasons that we talked about, right? They are cis heteronormative, they're white, they're bourgeois and middle class, and that's not acknowledged, right? It's just like kind of male and female desire. And as much as I appreciate your comments about the fact that I wrote about women's sexuality, that was kind of a missing piece, and that, whereas you write about men's sexuality, male sexuality, I write about women. I wish I didn't have to, right? I wish that I didn't have to do that, because I wish that wasn't the binary construct that we were working within. So I will say that. And so yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to say about models. I think that they're I don't think that. I think that just proliferating more and more models is not the answer. And so actually that brings me to, I think the last thing I'll say, and Patrick, you gave me so much to think about. And I knew you were going to, or I had a feeling you were going to approach this as a feminist psychologist, as someone who is invested in the psychology of gender. And I really appreciate that. But your work, a lot of the work that I've been reading recently that you have been putting out is really complicating the idea that I think has become the most common response to the problems of psychology, right? Is that, well, we need to study more people, right? We need more models. We need more complex models. We need to study, we shouldn't just be studying cis men and women. We should be studying people who identify as non-binary. We should be studying trans men and women. That's kind of the answer, right? And I do think that that's a problem in psychology and in sexology and in sex therapy, is that the answer becomes just study more and more people, and then we'll know more, and then we'll have kind of a more robust empiricism, and then so there's just this proliferation of categories and models and ways of thinking, but actually it's not ways of thinking, right? And I think that's the problem, is it becomes study more and more people and populations, but there's an anti-structuralism there, right? There's a kind of, it's not an actual challenging any of the structures. It's just adding more categories. And I think that that's really, that's not liberatory, right? That's not a liberatory project. So I really appreciate your work on that, and your pointing to what I do in that way in this book. I really appreciate the passages that you all pointed out. Jane, the passage that you pointed out, I think the one on 186 or 187 is actually one of my own favorite passages from my own book. I think that that really captures something that I'm trying to do in this book, which is to show that, ideally in a kind of like generous and loving way, that this thinking about women's desire and women's low desire has become the way that people think about themselves. And I think Patrick points to that too. It's just lots of people, lots of people don't have other ways to think, or it becomes so much part of the zeitgeist. It becomes so entrenched in popular media, you know, in popular media that's deeply informed by medicine and science, in the world that we live in, that becomes the way people think about themselves. And so there's very limited ways to think about one's own experience of low desire, kind of outside of those very highly gendered, cis, normative, heteronormative kind of frameworks. I really appreciate the passage that Patrick pointed out on page 77 about the categories just becoming more internally diverse. I mean, I think that's also what we're pointing at here, right? Is that intersectionality has to be a deeper, more structural kind of way of thinking as the way it was initially intended, right? It's just having more categories, just kind of like focusing on, you know, people who are not cis is not inherently liberatory. It is not inherently justice oriented. So I think that's really important. And I think I'm just gonna, I'll end. Well, first of all, I want to say I really appreciate, actually, I'll say this really quickly. Yeah, I really appreciate, Tom, what you brought up about thinking about the limits of the arguments I make about BDSM and about the racialization of kink and the way and the racism inherent in the ways that people interpret kink and kinkiness. I think that's really, really huge. And that's a huge question that I need to address. And I think that my chapter on BDSM and kink was not meant to be like a panacea for like, okay, well, this is like, it wasn't like, okay, sex therapy is flawed, so everybody should just, engage in BDSM. It was more to just say, what if we thought differently about receptivity? Kind of what I was kind of very jumblingly trying to say about desire. What if we just kind of thought differently and in a more, not about lack, not about this normative kind of ingrained, very gender normative essentialist kind of framework, but instead thought about a kind of active agentic receptivity, submission. So, but I understand that is, that I would do well to read that through an intersectional lens, perhaps in a way that I don't do as much in that chapter. I forget who asked the question, but also I think it was maybe Jane, just about the kind of ending with like, what is the sexual? And that is something I really, really want to, I think that's kind of the ultimate way that I end the book, right? Is to just say, well, what is the sexual? Why have we been so obsessed with it? How has it been kind of transposed into this entire market? And then how is that market, not just in terms of like Addy or Viagra, but how there's like an entire market, whether it's like self-care apps. I've recently downloaded like 10 low desire apps for women because I just wanted to kind of study them, and I'm going to be hopefully writing a new piece on that. And so the market is not just the drugs, right? There's an entire market for caring for oneself sexually, and there's this intense expectation to do that. But one thing that I really hope that came through in the book, and I think that it did, it seems like you all, from what I understand, picked this up, is that some of the anti-medicalization activism has been, I think, really deficient at taking seriously the ways that sexual mandates and compulsory sexuality is actually pushed on people. And that it's not just about like having a drug pushed down your throat. It's also about, well, what is that drug like? Addy and Viagra are totally different. Why is mindfulness pushed primarily on women? Why is that kind of the way that's, why is the market traditionally very much, and the entire research industry has been around women harnessing their desire through mindfulness. So yeah, it's not just my point is that it's not just like drugs versus natural. There are all these different ways that we're supposed to be working on our sexuality. And I like the idea of thinking about erotics and pleasure and maybe even desire as a pleasurable thing outside of those compulsory sexual frameworks, right? So some people, I don't know if you're still here, but I know Ella Prijbilo is here. I know KJ Sarankowski was here. Some folks, a lot too many folks to name, so sorry if I'm not naming you, but people who do asexuality studies work, right? Who I think are doing really amazing work to kind of push, well, what if we decentered orgasm? What if we thought differently about pleasure and intimacy and romance? What if we went back to Audre Lorde, and thought about conceptualizations of intimacy and care and love, that really do challenge us to either dispense with a certain kind of focus on the sexual and or really rethink the sexual. So I don't know, I mean, because I am interested in psychoanalysis, I don't want to totally dispense with the sexual completely. I'm interested, but I'm really interested in playing with it. I'm interested in thinking about how asexuality studies scholars are pushing those boundaries and allowing us to kind of decenter it in really productive and interesting ways. So I've talked for a long time and I want to open it up for questions. But I just want, the final thing I'll say is I really appreciate all of you also because this project was really hard. And I think Patrick probably maybe knows this the best, honestly, because he's in psychology. And it was really hard to write about people that understand themselves as feminists and understand themselves as pushing back against mainstream normative psychology. Because I don't want to make them angry or hurt their feelings, but I don't think that some of that work is going far enough. But it's hard to call out other feminists for being liberal and cultural feminists and engaging in a practice of white feminism. It's hard to do that productively and generously. And I tried really hard to do that. And I don't know how successful that was, but I really did try. And I hope that I get better at it. And I hope that I also can take lots of critique and improve myself and my own work. So thank you all so very, very much for engaging with my work.
Thank you, Allison. Allison, I don't know if you saw the chat, but Kristen Barber says, I appreciate your efforts to call out white feminism, as I think many of us in this room do as well. Audience members, give us your questions. So thank you so much for this brilliant book and brilliant conversation. Could you talk us through a bit about how you see this project in relation to crypt theorizing and crypt politics? And again, for anybody who posts in the chat, if you want to, turn on and elaborate a little bit, please do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is very much, as Tom was pointing out, a cryptistemological project. Insofar as I think whenever we're pointing out cis-centric, cis-normative things, heteronormative things, racist things, I think we're also pointing out ableism. I think that it makes sense to to think about those things as going hand in hand. And so I'll just say that. I mean, I think that, and I think that sexual function analyses are ableist, right? I think that these kinds of like having disorders for sexual deficiency are not only are not only in line with compulsory sexuality, but are also ableist, right? And they're not kind of thinking through all the non-normative or differently diverse ways that people experience pleasure in their bodies and their sexualities or their romantic experiences or not, or experiences that totally don't fit within those frameworks. So yeah, I guess I can just say that. I mean, I think that there's a lot here about trauma too, like the experience of trauma. I think that trauma is part of, or ignoring trauma, including gendered, racialized, heterosexualized normative trauma is ableist, to ignore those experiences of trauma. And so I think that there's a way that a lot of the psychologists that I'm critiquing kind of like bracket trauma. It's like trauma and PTSD are over here and low desires over here. And I'm like, but wait, they're not always totally separate, right? What about people who experience low desire or have different experiences of desire that are like absolutely comorbidly connected with their PTSD, or their chronic pain, So I think that I would say that that's the piece about where crip epistemology is so useful. And for people who don't know, crip epistemology, is centering, it's the epistemology of crip experience, which I think is very much part of my project.
Awesome. And I see that our amazing, fantastic organizer, Catherine, has a question.
Hi, thank you so much. Allison, thank you so much. And actually everyone on the panel, this has been like a dream of mine to bring all of you together. And really, I feel like everyone is here facilitating like my nerd fantasy. So like, thank you all for being here and taking part in this discussion and letting me just like nerd out with folks. I'll lower my hand there. So Allison, I want to kind of jump off something you said right at the end there, talking about what is the sexual, and actually it made me think a little bit about what is gendered, right? Like how is gender as this thing being co-constituted here? But actually the thing I really wanted to talk to you about or ask you about is the way in which these, or the way in which evidence is being marshaled in this area in the field of like women's sexuality research to stand in for certain kinds of ethical claims. So, or this kind of like fact value collapse distinction that's happening, right? And I'll say I'm thinking about this a lot in relation to work that I'm doing on those with intersex conditions, where in our field, it's quite interesting. We're in a kind of strange moment, I think, where often there is kind of descriptive evidence or facts that have been generated through studies of intersex folks. And it is unclear, what do we then do with that evidence, right? Are we trying to chart kind of a normal versus the abnormal? Are we making a normative claim about like this is how these people experienced something, so you should too, right? And there are some who have argued, and I agree with them, that actually this move towards more empirical evidence is a way of kind of displacing any kind of ethical responsibility and of like shifting the normative question, right? So of like, we're gonna let the evidence kind of stand in for the messy kind of normative work or claims that we might have to make. And one of the things that it strikes me about this kind of evidence, and especially evidence of individuals' experiences of their sexuality, of their gender, is that it is very temporally and culturally located, right? So it might be very important and revealing for us in the way that your interviews, I think, are so importantly revealing of the ways in which individuals who are taken up by this category then experience themselves and navigate all these discourses and these various kind of technologies. But given how shifting the terrain is, there's a question about like the applicability, I think, of those results, right? Or even in terms of thinking about other groups. And so I wanted to ask you, and this is like such a messy question, sorry, is about what do you think's going on here in terms of how the evidence that's being marshaled within feminist psychology or within the various kind of science fields that you're looking at, what kind of work is that, or is that evidence being asked to do in terms of making normative claims? Like, I think part of it is just, it's reifying cisnormativity, right? But I'm thinking more about like the ways in which, what is it doing for the researchers, right? Or not doing, or like, is it, because in some ways I feel like it ends up allowing us to not have to engage in certain kinds of discussions. We can just try to let the evidence fill in the gap, or maybe not. Just I'll just say, what do you think how is the evidence functioning that's being marshaled here?
I can speak quickly to this. I'd love to hear Patrick's thoughts too, actually, and other folks too. I think that a good example of this is, and this will probably be a circuitous answer here, but hopefully I'll keep it short. So a lot of this project developed around, the idea of the feminized responsive desire framework is kind of connecting these different strands, right? And one of those strands is Rosemary Bassan's circular sexual response model, right? Which was initially about women, and actually, we found out, and I think it's revealed actually probably in the articles, but that it's about straight women in like long-term heterosexual relationships. I don't think that she talked very much about like race or class backgrounds, but definitely it was like straight women in long-term relationships. And I think that the idea here is that her theorizing around the circularity of women's response and their kind of like trigger ability and their kind of like tendency toward being receptive. She actually didn't, I don't think she ever came out, maybe she did. She linked it to the female discordance, the plethysmographic research for sure. But she wasn't just like, hey, women are born like inherently, innately responsive. She was like, no, I'm just telling the story, right? I'm just revealing, I'm just exposing the evidence. I'm like, this is the evidence that I found. And some of it was qualitative, right? So, but I make the argument in the book there's kind of a violence there. And I think that that Patrick has made kind of a similar, I don't know if he used the word violence, but I think that when you leave something just purely at the level of description, it can make you, as a researcher, feel like you're doing justice, right? Because you're kind of exposing different sides of whatever. But I think it matters what you do with that, right? And it matters how you theorize it. And I think kind of like not theorizing it and not just like kind of putting it out there isn't liberatory, and it isn't actually helpful. And so I guess that speaks a little bit to like maybe what it does for the researcher, but then I think also what it does in the broad world in which it's kind of taken up and interpreted and consumed. And I think there's a vacuum there, right? There's a vacuum of like politics, but then of course politics are inserted, because then we find that briefly about like the female discordance research and the plethysmography. A lot of that was like, well, this is just what we're observing. But then evolutionary psychology ends up filling that void, and that's its own problem. So if anybody else wants to add to that, somewhat circuitous response, but I really appreciate that question about evidence-basedness and the kind of like valorization of things being evidence-based and the empirical at the expense of ethics. I think you're absolutely right to kind of point to that.
How did Jane refer to evolutionary psychology earlier? I think I love that, and I should have taken notes because I think it was something to the effect of like total nonsense. But it's of course deeply, deeply violent. To Allison's point, Catherine, I was sort of transfixed by your question. I don't think I'm going to offer a satisfactory response, but I do also want to note that Kevin Mosby, who I'm sure has lots to say on this, is in the room, and I'm so excited that he's here, but also Alex Rutherford, who's a brilliant feminist philosopher, historian of psychology, who I think would probably offer tremendous insight into your work, Allison, as well. But I kept being reminded as I was reading, and I've been listening to, I was reminded of Sarah Ahmed's The Promise of Happiness, which of course you do cite and engage in the book, Allison, but that quote, surely feeling better is better, and we all want to feel better. You noted in your comments that, Allison, that you're trying to do right by other feminists while also calling out white feminism, while also problematizing these feminist projects that have colluded with or advanced various forms of intersectional oppression. That's all really important. And I think that taking seriously feminist psychology does mean recognizing that this work is situated in a tension that is not just political or normative or ethical, as you put it, Catherine, but also like fundamentally epistemic, because so much of this work that feminist psychologists are doing. You talk about like sexual configurations theory from Sarah Van Anders. You cite Michelle Fine, Sarah McClelland, and others who you do not associate with, let me be clear, with like the advancement of female sexual dysfunction discourse, but talk about them as situated within this broad discourse on the psyche of women and gender. We, like sometimes including me, are operating within these disciplinary systems that are so violent. And the work that then feminist psychologists are doing to, like, sometimes the phrase is like to give voice or to represent, is done so sometimes with like the expressed intent of using evidence, the tools that are recognized as legitimate within the context of psychology, using evidence to challenge scientific racism, to challenge scientific misogyny. And so to dismiss it wholesale, which is not what you do in the book, is, I think, a bit naive. And instead, what you've done is uncover how, like, we have to move beyond stated politics and good intentions to consider how the normative structures, what I call, like, in that paper that you referenced, good psychology, how like good psychology necessitates a critique far beyond our good intentions. Because if in fact good psychology was doing the work it claims to do, like, well, good psychology would have cured implicit bias 20 years ago, right? Like, good psychology would have solved lots of the problems that it has sought to identify and address with a preponderance of evidence. And so I love this idea, Catherine, of like, what's the marshaling of the evidence to do? And I think it's always quite political, especially in the context of feminist psychology. So I'm sure others have more articulate things to say, but that's just some of the things that are rolling around in my head right now.
Thank you, Patrick. And it just so happens that Kevin does want to chime in.
Yes, thank you all. This has been quite a wonderful discussion in general, and I'm so impressed with all of the comments. And I must confess, I haven't read your book, Allison, but when I read it, the title, I honed in onto the whole desire concept and what does that mean, and also its relationship to, you cited Lord a few minutes ago, like what is the relationship in your mind with desire and the erotic, as Lord put it, but also as Patrick and Catherine's comments and your answer to that is something that I think about a lot as being a Black queer sociologist. And I think a lot about what I've been calling in my work, I'm working on sort of epistemic justice issues, which, you know, Patrick, in my mind, highlighted this, is about how we as sociologists and social scientists, our discipline itself is sort of reifies reifies the prominence, dominance of, you know, these white supremacist methods, these white supremacist patriarchal disciplines. And thus, the answer to Catherine's question, in my mind, is that, and again, it goes back to, we are using the master tools. And I think we know that these tools are limited, and thus, but we also are a product of those tools. But to get out of it, we're gonna have to do work mindful of social and racial justice, economic justice, and that's what we use the data for. And as scholars and writers, I think that's something that Angela Jones here, we all know Jones, her last name, but does so well in her book, Camming. It's just right there front and center. And I think we are due disservice to particularly our students if we don't do that, or, you know, if we don't do that. So I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot and I'm really hungry, so I might have to leave here for a second, but thank you. Yes, and thank you for, I was like, Angela, you should be putting your own book link in there when you put there. 'Cause I think,
Today is not about Mesa. So, Allison, did you want to respond? Or I know Alexandra also has a question.
I mean, I'll just say really quickly, thank you so much, Kevin. And I couldn't agree more. And I also really agree about Angela's book. And I think that, again, I just feel like I'm in such great company. And I feel, yeah, just the fact that, yeah, all of these sociological rebels are here makes me feel like I'm in the right place. So thank you. And thank you to you for your work too. Yeah.
Alexandra.
Thanks so much, Allison, for your book, which I have right here on my desk and have been poring over because it's so relevant to some of the stuff I'm working on right now. And apologies, I had to come in a bit late because of something else on Zoom from 1 to 2. So if my question is now completely irrelevant because it was already fully discussed earlier, it's my fault and you can just tell me. I actually, yeah, so I'm gonna stick with one question. Okay, so my one question is, and this is going a little bit beyond your book, but it's relevant to your book, and I want to hear your thoughts. So I just recently became aware of, and folks on this meeting may be well aware of this, but I just came across some of the work that Steve Epstein is doing now on looking at the processes behind writing the sexual health chapter in ICD-11. So the International Classification of Diseases, you focus a lot on DSM categories, but ICD-11 evidently is going to have a whole chapter on sexual health. Okay, and the article that I recently ran across that Epstein wrote was looking at developing a notion of what he calls cultivated co-production, where he kind of in STS, a lot of the work of science studies scholars is to kind of, reveal all of the entanglements of science and values and so on. But scientists themselves are kind of dedicated to maintaining this kind of distinction, right, between science and values. But in the process of writing the sexual health chapter for ICD-11, which is not due out until 2022, he observes that actually scientists are beginning to want to actually themselves start to efface that distinction, right? And invite the folks who are stakeholders in sexual health to the table. But the other thing that he talks about is the notion of reconfiguring sexual health along the lines of a rights discourse, right? That because it's a World Health Organization kind of exercise, that sexual health is about the right to sexual pleasure free from violence. And so I guess my question to you is, thinking about sexual health in the way that it's unfolding through the language of the ICD-10 revisions, does that address any of the concerns that you bring up very legitimately in the book about the relationship between violence and desire? And what might a rights framework bring to it, but what might it also start to occlude, or could it also be problematic? So I guess those are some thoughts.
Thank you for your question. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to read Stephen's article on this, although I have it kind of on deck. And I'm
okay. I just literally saw it the other day. So it's on my mind.
Yeah. No, I'm very excited to read it. And yeah, I mean, definitely Stephen Epstein is a huge, important interlocutor here for me. His work with Tom on photoplethysmography and men is super important to my own work for sure, and kind of the gendering of that discourse. Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, and I guess because I haven't read his article yet, I don't know exactly what to say to this, but I guess I have some trepidations, I guess, around just kind of health and rights, right? Like I guess I would say that. I think that that part of health, obviously, and I'm assuming Stephen would probably make a similar argument, but that health also has to be the right to kind of like not be healthy in the ways that we're expected to be healthy, right? That health has to be a very capacious, understanding. And I think that this is that's a very complicated kind of thing to think through, but I think that too often health involves a certain kind of normativity, right? And in the case of what I write about and what Steve and Tom write about is a kind of a mandate, a compulsoriness and normativity around discourses of health. So I guess we always have to just wonder how health is going to be measured. And then rights, of course, has all the same similar problems, rights for whom, who gets to decide on rights, just kind of all of the issues around rights discourse. Yeah, I mean, just kind of evolving, I guess, from like natural rights and like the idea that there are like individuals that have rights, and they're like a certain kind of like normative individual that should have a right. So just the kind of like concerns and questions I think I have around liberalism and discourses of sovereignty as they connect to health, to both health and rights. All of that said, I think if we can think about health and rights, and maybe we wouldn't be able to use quite these categories, but we could expand them beyond those very normative ideas, then they could be very useful, and it's very complicated because at the same time, I'm obviously talking from the perspective of a person in the global north, who is privileged in all kinds of ways. So I know that rights and health are at stake for lots of people in lots of different ways. I think that those terms get used in problematic ways. I'm very interested in the ICD-11 though, and I do focus on the DSM-5. There's a really weird tension right now between the ways that low desire is categorized in the DSM-5 versus the ICD-10. All of the ICDs are still using HSDD. I think it's kind of too long of a history to get into the kind of social and scientific debates around HSDD versus FSIAD, but I think that I focus on FSIAD because I think it was understood in the DSM-5 to be kind of an antidote to the problems with HSDD, and also specifically because HSDD is kind of like having that diagnosis would make you a potential consumer of Addy or flubanserin, right? You kind of like have to have that to get the drugs. And so I think FSIAD was meant to kind of like be, this is going to be different, this is better, this is the synthetic diagnosis that has all these different kinds of criteria, and therefore it will be better than HSDD. But I argue, that it's gendered and it kind of reifies complexity and female complexity and feminine complexity. This is circuitous, but yeah, I would love to talk with you more at some point about your thoughts on the ICD-11 and specifically once I've read Steve's article. But thank you for bringing that up.
Do we have any more questions? We still have another 15, 16 minutes or so. I'm happy to pose a few. I certainly don't want to take up space. If other folks want to drop something in the chat or raise their hand. All right, so I'll throw out a few ideas, and if folks want to, again, drop something in the chat, please do. In the interest of time, Allison, these are just several questions. I will ask them as briefly and succinctly as possible. Feel free to answer one of them, none of them. So one, and you did start to speak to this a little bit, and again, I don't want to pose any of these in a particularly leading way because I want to let you do with it what you want. But I'd love to hear more about, and I think the audience would benefit from hearing more about the feminized response desire framework in relationship to ACE and Arrow folks. I think, especially for those who haven't read the book, I see so much usefulness and power in this idea of power of sexual pleasure. Maybe that's a little bit self-serving, but I'd love to hear you maybe talk a little bit more about that. I was also thinking about, as I was reading the book, this sexual care industry, and I'd love to hear you talk more about that as a market, right? Like as a market, the same way you were kind of talking a little bit about the work that Jane does in her book. And then I know I said 3. And then I was also thinking about just the whiteness and the white supremacist of this white supremacy of, everything that's going on in the book. So.
Well, just briefly in order, and yeah, if other people want to chime in, other panelists or anyone else, I'd be interested in hearing Jane's thoughts actually as well, for sure. Yeah, I mean, the parasexuality concept, I definitely think that that's a really important kind of theoretical construct that for me emerges from my work and from the interviews and the data. It's very indebted to the work of other scholars who are in asexuality studies for sure. So, but yeah, I named Ella Pershpilo and KJ Sarankowski. I think Eunjung Kim is really important here, and so many other folks too. But so yeah, I mean, parasexuality I think is just kind of a way of thinking about sex, like what is good about sex, what is like useful about even like having this concept, but without being kind of hemmed in by normative ideas about what constitutes it, right? Like, so is there something kind of redeemable about like sex as it centers pleasure and desire, as it has the potential to do those things? And if so, then what can we still use, or how can we kind of like play with that concept or be like adjacent to the concept? And so that's what I wanted to get at in my kind of theorization of that concept in chapter 5. So the thinking about BDSM and kind of like the way that some participants describe it as a meditative practice, as something that's almost like there's a connection involved, but that it's almost not sexual in the ways that we would expect. That it's more about sensation, that it's more about it's almost, there's like a solitariness to it. I think kind of thinking about it in those ways kind of takes it away from that really normative partner dyadic, and then often cis and heteronormative kind of framing. Amber Jamila Musser is another person that's written on masochism, and particularly about sensation and affect and race. So that's another great person to kind of look to, and I can put that in the chat in a moment. But yeah, so I appreciate you pointing to parasexuality and kind of thinking about. I think that's where I have the most resonances with crit theory and critical feminist madness studies and disability studies, and definitely ACE and Arrow theorizing. So yeah, I would say that about that. And then your other two questions were, oh wait, and one other thing about parasexuality is I think it also helps us to kind of think about asexuality or parasexuality, these adjacent kinds of processes as processes, right? Not as identities. And I think that some of the people that I just named who are amazing ACE scholars are also pushing the boundaries of that, right? That asexuality is not just an identity. It's an experience, it's a process, it's an embodied experience, it's a phenomenology. And I think that helps us to get outside of the way that a lot of even the more feminist psychologists have kind of framed it, right, as primarily identity. The stuff about the self-care industry, I'm going to just bracket for a moment, but I do just want to say, I mean, for me, the whiteness piece, I think to be really honest, it emerged later. It emerged as I did this work. I was like, I'm just going to interview people about their desire and sexuality and women. And I think that my evolution as a scholar in the last decade or more, also, I was like, oh, this is about whiteness. This is about like whiteness and bourgeoisness and about a certain kind of normativity that goes well beyond cisness and heterosexuality. And so I think also just thinking about evolutionary psychology as white is a huge piece of that as well. But yeah, and the self-care stuff, honestly, that's kind of more emerging. I focus on the mindfulness here for the reasons that I describe in the book. But I don't know, if Jane knows more, if anybody else wants to chime in about that, I'd be super interested. As I said, I downloaded like 10 women's desire enhancement apps. And I do hope to write a short piece soon. So I can definitely send that to folks if they're interested when I find a home for that. If anybody else wants to jump in on any of those questions, I would love to hear other people's thoughts.
I could speak about that all day, but Tom, you had your hand up. I mean, I'll just say briefly that, absolutely the classification of gradients of desire has pretty profound market implications, so that, you know, you can get people to self-diagnose. So you want to get them into the therapist's office because that's going to be the pathway to various kinds of consumption practices through diagnosis and then remedies and treatments. But you don't even have to get them into the therapist's office. You can just get them online to self-diagnose. And then often those Goop and these other websites that are about self-diagnosis and self-care, that are targeting white middle-class women, have the links right there. So you're directed immediately to the products you're supposed to buy, whether it's herbal supplements or body work or whatever it may be. So I think you're really right on to be highlighting the market forces that are just below the surface, always, always, of these various classificatory systems. But Tom, you were going to say something.
Well, I wanted to go back to this question someone raised about cripistemology. Cripistemology, am I saying it right? You talked a lot about how the question was about how you theorize, you know, how you develop any kind of theory based on this cripistemology, and I wondered if you could elaborate a bit. You talked about it, you know, you're challenging what's normative and such, but in the book you say certain enactments of low desire among feminized and their psychological manifestations are potentially political, subversive, and even insurrectionary. And I wondered if you could elaborate on that. You know, that I've really found that to be really moving. Like one of the ways in which, as I do think Patrick's right, that you're really advancing science studies here by bringing together this kind of evidence with the story of the science, you know, the evidence of what these women are actually saying. And I wondered if you could elaborate about what you mean by how this can be insurrectionary.
Yeah, I mean, the point about cripistemology is, I mean, I think cripistemology, the way that I think about it, and I think other folks here are definitely working within that area, is to combine you just standpoint theory, you know, thinking about just epistemological kind of the way that kind of autobiographical experience, you know, is its own, you know, narrative evidence. And that's absolutely drawing from both feminist science studies and Black feminist scholarship, for sure. So yeah, and I think in the case of my work, it's about centering, well, on the one hand, kind of a traumatized subject, a traumatized subjectivity, and saying, well, what can we learn if we listen to people who have experienced either, you know, abuse and assault or assault adjacent experiences, as I call it in the book. So, you know, and thinking about trauma as a broad, you know, there's a lot that can be kind of under that broad rubric, but kind of saying, well, if we listen to the voices of folks who are in those positions, we could learn a lot, you know, about what it's like. And then I think the other piece of it for me in the book is to say, I don't think that I'm giving, and this is actually really crucial, I don't think that I'm giving like women a voice. That's not actually the object of this project. My whole point of this book is to say that people are produced as women, right? That these like populations are produced that kind of invoke femininity and create feminized subjects and populations. So it's about feminization, and then it's about, so it's not saying like, let's give women a voice. I think that that's what the feminist psychologists that I critique are doing. I'm saying, no, let's think about how subjects are actually constituted through these discourses, through using mindfulness, through, you know, all of the ways that that people are feminized, and then give them a voice, you know, and then and say, well, what was that experience like? You know, like, how did you come to, you know, experience yourself as having low desire if you have a framework of thinking about femininity in mind, you know, and a certain kind of femininity? Yeah, so I hope that you know, that makes sense and that it comes across. But this is a book about how people become feminized and how processes of feminization operate, including through the self-care industry, through medicine, through science and sexology, how they're then kind of offered to people, and how they then become lived and embodied and kind of phenomenologically experienced. And so that's when I want to give people the voice. You know, it's kind of, if that makes sense. And so I hope that that's something that's kind of different about this work. And I think it's a type of epistemology. I'll say that.
Wonderful. We have like 3 minutes left. Does anybody have a quick question? Or I certainly also want to invite the panelists and Allison, if there's any kind of final comments or questions that anybody wants to raise.
I'm just going to say really quickly on the point, since I didn't fully answer your question about the self-care industry. I want to say, building off of Jane's point, I don't think that mindfulness is like inherently bad. I want to make that clear. I think that there's ways that mindfulness or mindfulness adjacency or, you know, meditative experiences can emerge that can be really exciting, and that it can be a therapeutic tool for people. But I think that the distinction I kind of want to make is that, and I think this is what separates my work from some other kind of anti-FSD, anti-medicalization feminist discourses, is I'm not just like, oh, there's the pharmaceutical industry, or there's the mindfulness industry, or there's Goop doing this thing. I think it's a really complicated way that all this comes together, right? It's like, we have female discordance, we have receptivity, we have this new diagnosis, you know, we have self-care and mindfulness as a broad technology that all of us are supposed to be working on ourselves with, you know, and be more productive through. And then like all of that comes together. And then there's a research industry, you know, and then there's funding for mindfulness, you know, to study it. And then there's the app, you know, and then there's the market. So it's not just like pushing mindfulness down people's throats. It's like mindfulness emerges in this really complex network of late neoliberal racial capitalism, right? And then that's when it gets you.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. Because I think, you know, personally, I'm not sure, or I'd argue that I'm not sure we always spend enough time thinking about the intersections of capitalism, sexualities, and science. And so I appreciate that. And I just kind of, I guess, wanted to bring capitalism into the conversation for a moment. Jane, I think, did you have a kind of final, something you wanted to say there for a second?
I was going to ask Allison, what's next? What are they working on?
Oh, that's a good question. I actually have I am working on self-care stuff broadly. So I am trying to place an article on the white feminine masochism of mindfulness. And so the whole kind of like, who's the sub, who's the dom, the mind and the body thing that actually Angela speaks to as well in Camming in the chapter on pleasure. Yeah, so I'm really interested in that. That's a kind of a shorter piece that emerged from a conference paper. And then I am working on a book on applying Black feminist, abolitionist, and decolonial theory to today's self-care industry. And that'll bring in some of the critiques that I mentioned in Diagnosing Desire, but it will also talk about Goop, you know, and that kind of stuff, like that market more explicitly. Right. And then also kind of taking up what Angela pointed out in the beginning, which is to kind of focus on how I end the book, which is, well, what could be therapeutic beyond the clinic? What could be therapeutic beyond the mindfulness app? Like, what is therapy when it's actually feminist, anti-racist, and like communist or, you know, anti-capitalist? So I think that's where my work is going. So I have an article or like a shorter piece, a book, and then my future work. I'm really interested in AI and sex bots and sexual surrogacy. And so I'm going to be thinking about that. And that's a very kind of nascent project, but I'm going to be exploring that more. So I'm very excited about that. But thank you for asking that, Jean.
Well, those are some very exciting things to end on and things to look forward to down the road. I want to thank everyone so much for being here and being part of this panel. I think all of us have a lot to think about for the next little while. And to thank Allison for giving us this opportunity by way of this beautiful book. Thank you everyone so much for coming. And again, please feel